Constructing the world is part of a wider philosophical project. In numerous published papers and a forthcoming companion book titled The Multiplicity of Meaning, you defend the Freudian conception of meaning, content and reference, embodied in a two-dimensionalist framework. What is the two-dimensionalist framework, and how does your epistemic interpretation of this framework differ from more traditional conceptions developed by Kaplan?
Two-dimensional approaches to semantics are roughly those that have two different dimensions or aspects of meaning. And traditionally, one dimension is especially tied to the epistemological and cognitive realm. One dimension is especially tied to the environment and to reference. In some ways, we can see Frege's distinction between, say, sense and reference as a precursor for many forms of two-dimensional semantics. Sense is one dimension, reference is another. But, in recent years, two-dimensional semantics has especially been understood as a semantic framework where the two different dimensions are both understood modally, in terms of something like possible worlds, and where the semantic values are something like functions over possible worlds, where every sentence is associated with a set of possible worlds or a function from possibilities to truth values. Carnap was responsible for introducing intentions as a semantic value and meaning and necessity, and argued there they could play a serious Fregean role in understanding, playing many of the roles of Fregean senses, connecting to epistemology, and so on. Later on, Kripke suggested that given the phenomena of the necessary a posteriori, modal notions like possibility come apart from epistemological notions like a priority. And so these intentions defined in terms of possible worlds no longer can play that epistemological role. We've got at least intentions defined over metaphysically possible worlds don't seem to be constrained in the Fregean way. For example, Hesperus and phosphorus. Hesperus is phosphorus will have an intention that's true at all metaphysically possible worlds, even though it's a posteriori. The intentions come apart from the connection to a priority. So two-dimensional modal frameworks, as I understand them, posit a different kind of intention, apart from this intention of the metaphysically possible worlds. That's the second dimension. But there's also another dimension on which there are intentions that are much more closely tied to things like the a priori. And Kaplan and Stolnecker in the 1970s had two-dimensional frameworks that went somewhat this way, although they were both limited in different ways. Kaplan applied his framework mostly to indexicals and demonstratives, and said, for example, I am here now has what he called a character, which is a kind of, it's a function from context to contents, but it could be associated with a, you can think of these contexts as a bit like possibilities. And he argued that the fact that I am here now is more or less a priori, connects to it having a character that's true in all contexts. Now, he limited that claim to certain indexicals and demonstratives, didn't try to extend it to proper names. Now, in his framework, things break down. Hesperus and phosphorus have the same character, but Hesperus and phosphorus is still a posteriori. Stolnecker did something a bit similar with his very different two-dimensional framework in the late 70s. Kaplan defined it just in terms of context dependence of expressions within a natural language. Stolnecker defines his diagonal propositions in terms of what an expression might pick out, perhaps if used with a different meaning. Hesperus might have been used to pick out a different thing if it had been in a world where Jupiter was visible in the evening sky. And in his 1978 paper, Assertion, he suggests that these things are strongly connected to the a priori. He says the type of necessary diagonal proposition is to be a priori. Now, he fairly rapidly backed off that claim, because given the way that his diagonal propositions are defined, it looks like even, there'll be worlds where the word bachelor is used to mean horses or something, and then, all bachelors are unmarried males, certainly needn't come out true relative to those worlds. But I think of both Kaplan and Stolnecker as pushing us towards a two-dimensional framework with different dimensions of meaning, one of which is tied to necessity, that's the Kripke one, another one of which is tied to the a priori. I just think we need to do it in a somewhat more thoroughgoing way. So in my work, I've tried to develop what I call epistemic two-dimensional semantics, in which there is this first dimension of the meaning that's deeply tied to the a priori. And I think the key to doing this is to actually understand, the second dimension of meaning is intentions over metaphysically possible worlds. But the first dimension of meaning is intentions over epistemically possible worlds, or what I call epistemically possible scenarios. So if an expression like water it picks out H2O in every metaphysically possible world, sure. But now it's epistemically, and that corresponds to the fact, as Kripke's pointed out, that it's metaphysically necessary that water is H2O. But Kripke himself acknowledges it's not epistemically necessary that water is H2O. It's epistemically possible that water is XYZ, at least for all we know a priori. So I think this corresponds to the fact there are epistemically possible worlds, or what I call epistemically possible scenarios, where water picks out XYZ, as well as H2O. Its intention of a metaphysical possible world always goes with H2O, but its intention of epistemically possible worlds goes sometimes H2O, sometimes XYZ. And this leads to what I call the primary intention in two-dimensional semantics, and I argue that we can define that. So the secondary intention of water is H2O is true everywhere, metaphysically possible worlds. Primary intention is false at some worlds, corresponding to the fact it's a posteriori. So I think for a sentence to be a priori goes along with it having a primary intention that's true at all epistemically possible scenarios. So that's the epistemic 2D framework. I see the scrutability framework as articulating the epistemological foundations of that project. Because roughly to define these primary intentions, you have to define the best way to define them, I think, is in terms of scrutability. So what is the primary intention of water is H2O true at the actual world? Well, this goes along with whether it's scrutable from an underlying description of the actual world in terms of PQTI. Is it true at the twin Earth world? Well, this goes along whether it's scrutable from a description of the twin Earth world, say, given by something like PQTI star. And I think, no. From PQTI star, it's scrutable that water is not H2O. And so one can actually use this scrutability framework to define up, actually you can use it first to define up the epistemically possible scenarios themselves in terms of a scrutability base. Second, to define these intentions. And then if I'm right about with certain scrutability assumptions, it turns out that primary intentions so defined do have this deep connection to the a priori, and we do have a dimension of meaning which is tied very closely once again to the epistemological, as both Frege and Kahn wanted.
This epistemic interpretation of two-dimensionalism, is your semantics fundamentally internalist? That is the content, the semantic content or reference always fixed by what is in the head?
Two-dimensional semantics is pluralist in this way. I think of it as having one dimension which is broadly internalist and one dimension which is broadly externalist. So for water, we have this secondary intention, dimension of meaning, which is picks out H2O in all worlds. And that's constitutively dependent on facts about our environment. There's also this primary intention, which for me picks out roughly the watery stuff in any given epistemically possible scenario. H2O in our world, but XYZ in different ones. And this is, I think, much more plausibly internalist. For example, when Oscar on Twin Earth uses the term water to pick out H2O, Twin Oscar uses it to pick out XYZ. I think they plausibly have different secondary intentions, because of the differences in their environment, but the same primary intention. So I've argued, both in this book and in some other work, that primary intentions can actually play the role of narrow content. So now we have an internal dimension of meaning, the narrow one, and an external dimension of meaning, the wide one. Primary intentions narrow, secondary intentions wide. I mean, this doesn't make me fundamentally internalist or externalist. I don't think, probably deep down I'm more internalist than externalist, in that it's natural to tell a picture on which the internal content somehow determines the external content. The fact that I have got a primary intention that picks out the watery stuff, and combined with certain facts about the actual world, yields H2O as the referent, and then the secondary intention. I will note, though, that direction of priority is not obligatory. You can embrace the two-dimensional framework without claiming that the secondary intention of the referent is grounded in the primary intention. You could argue they have a certain autonomy, or that neither of them is prior to the other. I think those questions are, so to some extent, open. But my sympathy, it's true that my sympathies are fairly broadly internalist.
You hold that scrutability theses, which are exposed in constructing the world, ground an internalist view of content, a Fregean view of content, which you will defend in the multiplicity of meaning. So do you think that if mental internalism turned out to be false, then a priori scrutability would also be false?
Well, there's so many different ways in which internalism, since I think that internalism is true, to go to a world where the hypothesis that internalism is false, that we're going perhaps to a counter-possible world, at least there's many different ways in which internalism could turn out to be false. mean, there's some ways in which I think it is false. I think there are aspects of mental content which are external, like reference, secondary intentions, and so on. But I think that's completely consistent with a priori scrutability. I'm also sympathetic with the extended mind thesis, on which aspects of intentionality of our minds can extend outside the world into our notebooks, our iPhones, and so on. But then I think you can see this just leads to a broader internalism where mental content depends not just on what's in the head, but what's in the cognitive system, whether it's going to be construed to include the notebook or the iPhone. Maybe what you're suggesting, what if a more thoroughgoing internalism turned out to be false? There's no narrow content at all. Maybe no narrow expressions for the scrutability base. I think you could still have a scrutability project. You could have a scrutability project where nothing is narrow. I think, for example, somebody like Christopher Peacock is fairly sympathetic with something like the scrutability project, although he's much less internalist than I am. He thinks that you may not have this basic class of expressions with narrow content. Even the primitive concepts get their content from the external world. But nonetheless, there's a class of primitive concepts. And I think he's at least open to the idea that all truths are scrutable from there. So then he'd have scrutability from a small base, maybe even from a base of primitive concepts, but he wouldn't have narrow content. I think then he'd have to give up on one application of the scrutability project to grounding narrow content, but he could still use it to ground, for example, Frege senses, somewhat more externalist now, Frege senses, and even have a certain connection to the a priori. Maybe he'd have to go a bit more externalist about the a priori, but this brings out that, there are many applications of the scrutability framework, and the application to internalism is just one of them. And maybe there are even more thoroughgoing ways in which internalism could turn out to be false. So there weren't even these a priori connections at all. So maybe there are certain externalists who are totally skeptical about the a priori, totally skeptical about there being any constitutive connections between concepts. Then you might start to worry about the whole scrutability project. But now the worries, I think, go much deeper than just worries about internalism and externalism.